The thing about being on a generation ship is that generations are just about the only thing you can count on. People get born, people die, and in between they eat, sleep, and try not to strangle each other in their sleep. The resilience was no different, except maybe for the part where it seemed like someone was actively trying to get everyone killed. Kaller sat in his tiny data pod, which was just a fancy term for a metal cubicle with wires that would make a spaghetti enthusiast weep, staring at a screen that refused to tell him anything useful. Data engineer, he'd mutter to himself as if it were a job title, and not just a euphemism for space janitor. He had long since accepted that nobody else appreciated the art of data wrangling. "Hey Kaller, you find any new ways to kill us all yet?" grinned Jessa, his colleague who was perpetually on the wrong side of cheerful. She leaned against the doorway, a mug of something that was probably supposed to be coffee in her hand. "Not today," Kaller replied, rubbing his eyes. "Just the usual life support glitches and mysterious power drains. You know, normal Tuesday stuff." He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, a nagging suspicion like a popcorn kernel stuck in his brain. "I heard people are starting to get paranoid," Jessa said, taking a sip of her coffee and grimacing. "Rumors about shapeshifters. Can you believe that?" Kaller chuckled, though it lacked genuine amusement. "Yeah, because dealing with the usual madness isn't enough. Gotta add shapeshifting aliens to the mix. Next, they'll say they're cannibals too," Jessa shrugged. "Could be worse. Could be politicians." They both shared a laugh, though it was the kind that was more about coping than humor. The resilience was about as united as a bag of angry cats, each section of the ship its own little fiefdom with grudges older than the voyage itself. Kaller knew that if there was any truth to the alien rumors, it would only take a spark to set the whole place ablaze. Later, Kaller found himself elbows deep in the guts of the mainframe, running diagnostics that seemed to do as much good as slamming his head against it. He was about to call it a day when a notification blinked on his console, innocuously labeled anomaly detected. The two-word phrase had as much potential for disaster as nuclear launch or free drinks. He scanned the data, his eyes narrowing. "This can't be right," he muttered, checking the feed again. Something was playing merry hell with the systems, like a kid with a universal remote for reality. He tapped his comm unit, patching through to the security officer. "Rathok, you there?" A gravelly voice came through the speaker, dripping with the kind of suspicion usually reserved for used spaceship salesmen. "What do you want, Kaller?" "Got an anomaly in Section 7. Could be nothing, could be something. Thought you'd want to know." "Define something," Rathok replied, sounding like he regretted asking already. "Something as in it could be those shapeshifters everyone is so keen to gossip about." Kaller tried to keep his tone light, but the weight of the implication was enough to crack a lesser man's spine. "You're joking, right?" "Oh, I'm all about the comedy, Rathok. Next week, stand up on Deck 12. There was a pause on the line where Kaller could practically hear Rathok rolling his eyes. "All right, I'm on it. Just make sure you're not wasting my time." Kaller cut the connection, a sense of unease settling over him. He didn't like the idea of alien shapeshifters any more than the next person, but there were only so many coincidences he could ignore before it stopped being paranoia and started being survival instinct. The resilience was a marvel of human engineering, with all the charm of a decrepit cruise liner and the reliability of a politician's promise. It was supposed to be humanity's ticket to the stars, a fresh start for the species. Instead, it felt more like an elaborate coffin drifting through the void. Kaller's stomach growled, reminding him that paranoia worked up quite the appetite. He made his way to the mess hall, a place that was neither messy nor a hall, but rather a claustrophobic room where food went to die. He sat down with a tray that might have contained something edible in a past life, opposite Jessa, who was energetically stabbing at her meal. "Any updates from our friendly neighborhood shapeshifters?" she asked, not looking up. "Nah," Kaller replied, shoveling a forkful of questionably textured protein into his mouth. "Just the usual existential dread." You know, Jessa said, pointing her fork at him like an accusing finger, if these shapeshifters were any smart, they'd just take over the food supply, make us all too sick to care. That's just cynical enough to be true, Kaller said, shaking his head. But hey, maybe they'll save us from eating this crap. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the other end of the room. Rathok had entered, his presence like a storm cloud sucking the cheer out of the room. Listen up, he barked, and the room quieted down. There's been an incident in Section 7. All personnel are to remain on high alert until further notice. Anyone not compliant will find themselves introducing vacuum to their lungs. The room buzzed with murmurs as Rathok left, and Kaller felt his earlier unease return like a bad meal. Well, Jessa said, pushing her tray away, isn't this ship just a barrel of laughs? Kaller sighed, knowing full well that if things were hairy now, they were about to get downright monstrous. He finished his meal, the taste of impending doom lingering on his tongue. As he made his way back to his pod, the corridors seemed darker, the usual hum of the ship an ominous growl in his ears. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, lurking just beyond the edge of sanity. He stopped by a viewport, staring out at the endless expanse of stars. It was beautiful in a way that only the stark, indifferent vastness of space could be. We gotta survive this, he muttered, trying to convince himself more than the universe. His comm unit buzzed, breaking the spell. Kaller, get to the control room, Rathok's voice snapped. We've got a situation. Kaller didn't bother to reply, breaking into a jog down the corridor. The control room was a hub of activity, screens flashing warnings in a technicolor nightmare. Rathok stood in the center, directing traffic like a maestro of chaos. What's going on? Kaller asked, skidding to a halt. Systems are going haywire, Rathok growled, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack a diamond. I need you to figure out what's causing it before we end up as space debris. Kaller nodded, diving into the data with the fervor of a priest on a mission. It was chaos, pure and simple, lines of code twisted and corrupted beyond recognition. This isn't random, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Someone's doing this on purpose. You think it's them? Rathok asked, his voice low and dangerous. I think, Kaller replied, looking up, that we're about to find out. The lights flickered and the ship groaned like a dying animal. Kaller's heart raced, a cold sweat creeping down his spine. Brace yourselves, Rathok ordered, his voice cutting through the panic like a knife. We're in for a bumpy ride. And as the Resilience lurched, Kaller couldn't help but wonder if they'd survive long enough to find out who was really pulling the strings. Kaller stood in the control room, surrounded by screens flashing more warnings than a nightclub on fire. Rathok loomed beside him, watching the data scroll past like a hawk eyeing a particularly juicy mouse. The air was thick with tension, broken only by the hum of the failing generators and the occasional curse from a stressed-out tech. Find anything useful yet? Rathok growled, crossing his arms like he was preparing to wrestle the ship into submission. Depends on your definition of useful, Kaller replied, tapping on his console. If by useful you mean further proof we're all screwed, then yes, I've got loads of that. Rathok snorted, a sound that could have been a laugh in some alternate universe. Great, call the captain, will you? This mess needs a bigger broom. Kaller flicked his comm unit on, his tone sardonic. Captain Vexen, this is Kaller. We've got a situation that requires your esteemed presence. And by esteemed, I mean please save us from dying horribly. A moment later, Captain Vexen's voice crackled through the speakers, smooth as oiled steel. On my way, Kaller. Hold the fort until then. Sure thing, Captain. We'll be here, holding so tight our knuckles turn white, Kaller muttered as he ended the call. True to his word, Captain Vexen strode into the room with all the authority of someone who had long since given up on pretending he had control over anything. His uniform was immaculate, a small miracle given the state of everything else. Report, he demanded, looking between Kaller and Rathok with the kind of expectation usually reserved for parental visits on report card day. Systems are going berserk, Kaller said, pointing at the screens. Someone's been tampering with the code. It's not random, it's sabotage. Vexen's eyebrows rose, which was about as close to an emotional outburst as he ever got. And you think it's these shapeshifters? Could be, Kaller shrugged. Or it could just be that the universe hates us. Either way, I don't recommend ignoring it. Vexen sighed, the kind of sigh that could power a small turbine. Fine, we'll investigate. I want all key systems on lockdown. No one goes anywhere without my say-so. Already on it, Captain, Rathok said, his voice a gravelly rumble. But what about the rumors? People are getting jittery. Jittery? Kaller laughed, a hollow sound. They're about a hair's breadth from full-on mutiny. Noted, Vexen said dryly. Let's keep this contained. Kaller, Elira's in engineering, get her up to speed. We need all hands on deck if we're going to figure this out. On it, Kaller said, already moving. It was shaping up to be one hell of a day. Kaller found Elira elbow-deep in machinery that looked like it had seen better centuries. Unlike most of the crew, she had a knack for keeping things running even when they were determined to die a slow, painful death. Her hair was tied back, grease streaked across her face like war paint. "Hey, Elira," Kaller called over the din of whirring gears and sputtering sparks. "Got a minute?" She straightened, wiping her hands on a cloth that was probably cleaner before she'd started. "For you, Kaller, always." "What's up, sabotage?" he said, cutting to the chase. "Someone's messing with the systems, and it's not just bad luck." Elira's eyes narrowed, and she blew out a breath that sent a stray hair flying. "Shapeshifters, maybe, or just some asshole with a grudge. Either way, we need to lock things down. Captain's orders." "Fantastic," she said with a roll of her eyes. "Because what we really needed was more paranoia." "Tell me about it," Kaller agreed. "Want to help me figure this out before we all implode?" "Sure," Elira said, grabbing a toolkit. "But don't expect miracles. I'm an engineer, not a miracle worker." They spent the next hour crawling through the bowels of the ship, tracing wires and muttering curses that would have made a sailor blush. Every so often, Kaller had to resist the urge to punch something, usually the closest unreachable bolt. Finally, they reached a junction box that looked like it had been assembled by a drunk octopus. Elira peered inside, her expression one of resigned disgust. "Lovely," she muttered. "Someone's been in here all right." "See this?" She pointed to a tangle of wires that looked more like a bird's nest than part of a high-tech spaceship. "Yeah, I see it," Kaller said, "and it's about as reassuring as a dentist with a chainsaw." Elira grimaced, pulling out a small scanner. "Let's see what secrets you're hiding." The scanner beeped and whirred, and a stream of data flowed across the screen. Kaller watched, his heart sinking with every line. "This isn't just sabotage," Elira said, her voice tight. "It's an entire rewrite. Someone's been rewiring us from the ground up." "Shapeshifters," Kaller said, feeling the word settle like a lead weight in his gut. "Or a very determined saboteur," Elira countered. "Either way, we've got a problem." "Tell me something I don't know," Kaller replied, running a hand through his hair. "We'd better report this to Vexen." They made their way back to the control room, the corridor feeling longer with every step. Kaller's mind raced, trying to piece together a puzzle that seemed determined to remain unsolved. When they arrived, Captain Vexen was in a heated discussion with Rathok, their tones hushed but intense. Kaller cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "Captain, we've got more bad news," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Of course you do," Vexen said with a sigh. "Lay it on me." "Whoever's behind this isn't just messing around," Elira said, stepping forward. "They're rewriting our systems. This isn't just sabotage, it's a takeover." Rathok swore under his breath, his hands clenching into fists. "So what do we do about it?" "We need to find the source," Kaller said, "before they finish whatever it is they are planning." "Agreed," Vexen said, his jaw set. "But we need to do it quietly. The last thing we need is a panic." "Too late for that," Rathok muttered. "Crew's already on edge. It won't take much to push them over." "Then we work fast," Vexen said, turning to Kaller and Elira. "Find the source and do it now." Kaller nodded, the weight of the ship's fate settling on his shoulders. "We'll do our best," he promised, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. As they left the control room, Kaller couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The resilience was a powder keg, and all it needed was a spark. Back in his data pod, Kaller felt more like a data archaeologist than an engineer, trying to dig through layers of corrupted code and find a trace of the saboteur. Meanwhile, Elira worked alongside him, her hands a blur as she adjusted circuits and rerouted power. "You know," Kaller said, breaking the silence, "if we make it out of this alive, I think I'll start appreciating the little things more." Elira snorted, not looking up from her work. "Like what? Breathing." "Exactly," Kaller said with a grin. "And maybe not living in constant fear of being blown to bits." "Dream big," Elira replied dryly, though there was a hint of a smile on her lips. As they worked, strange incidents began to escalate throughout the ship. Lights flickered on and off like a bad horror movie, and doors that should have stayed open slammed shut without warning. It wasn't long before the crew's paranoia reached a fever pitch. Kaller overheard snippets of conversations as he passed through the corridors, each more absurd than the last. "I swear I saw one of them in the med bay," a crew member whispered, eyes darting nervously. "That's nothing," another replied. "I heard they can look like anyone, your best friend, your lover, anyone." "Great," Kaller muttered to himself. "Let's add trust issues to our growing list of problems." By the time Kaller and Elira returned to the control room with their findings, the tension was palpable. Vexen and Rathok stood at the center of the chaos, issuing orders amidst a cacophony of alarms and panicked voices. "We found the source," Kaller announced, holding up a data chip, "but you're not gonna like it." "At this point, I don't like much of anything," Vexen replied wearily. "What's the verdict?" "It's coming from the core," Elira said. "Someone's planted a remote access node. It's deep-rooted, and if it's not dealt with, we're looking at full system failure." Vexen swore, a rare breach in his composed demeanor. "Can you shut it down?" "Maybe," Kaller said, "but it won't be easy. We'll need to get into the core, and it's probably crawling with whoever's behind this." "Then we don't have a choice," Vexen said. "Rathok, assemble a team. Kaller, Elira, get ready to move. We're putting an end to this now." As the team prepared to head out, Kaller felt a mix of dread and determination. The ship was hanging by a thread, and it was up to them to save it. "Ready?" Elira asked, checking her gear one last time. "As I'll ever be," Kaller replied, trying to ignore the knot in his stomach. "Let's do this," Rathok said, his voice a low growl. "And if we find any shapeshifters, remind me to shoot first and ask questions never." Kaller managed a grim smile. "I'll hold you to that." Together, they moved out, every step taking them closer to the heart of the ship and the mystery that lay within. As they made their way through the corridors, Kaller couldn't help but think about the rumors. Shapeshifters, saboteurs, it didn't matter what was behind the madness. What mattered was stopping it before they all became a cautionary tale about what happens when humanity tries to reach beyond the stars. "Here's hoping we end up on the right side of history," Kaller muttered, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. "History," Elira shot back. "Let's just try not to end up on the wrong side of an airlock." Kaller chuckled despite himself, the sound a small comfort in the tense silence that followed. As they approached the core, he steeled himself for whatever lay ahead, knowing that whatever it was, they'd face it together. And with any luck, they'd live to tell the tale, preferably over a drink that didn't taste like recycled despair. Kaller and Elira trudged down the corridor toward the ship's core, accompanied by Rathok and a team of grim-faced enforcers. It was like the worst field trip ever, minus the educational value, and with a higher chance of violent death. Kaller resisted the urge to make a sarcastic comment about the ship's interior design, which could best be described as post-apocalyptic chic, and focused on the task at hand. "So what's the plan, boss?" Rathok grunted, hefting a particularly menacing-looking plasma rifle that seemed more appropriate for a movie poster than actual combat. Kaller shrugged. "Find the shapeshifters, stop them from turning us into cosmic roadkill. You know, the usual." Rathok snorted. "And here I thought today was gonna be boring." "Let's just hope we don't accidentally shoot one of our own," Elira chimed in. "I'm not cleaning up that paperwork. They reached the core access door, which was locked tighter than a miser's wallet. Kaller tapped a code into the panel, and the door groaned open like it was doing them a favor. "Welcome to your doom," Kaller said with a flourish, stepping inside. The core room was a maze of pipes and consoles, bathed in the flickering light of malfunctioning LED. It felt like stepping into the belly of a dying beast, which, given the circumstances, was probably accurate. "Spread out and look for anything suspicious," Rathok ordered, waving his team forward. And by suspicious, I mean anything more suspicious than usual, which is saying something. Kaller and Elira moved to a console, plugging in the data chip they'd found. The screen spat out a mess of corrupted code that made Kaller's eyes cross. It was like trying to read a novel written by a cat walking across a keyboard. "Can you make sense of this?" Elira asked, peering over his shoulder. Kaller shook his head. "Not unless I suddenly gain superhuman computing abilities, which, given our luck, might happen before lunch." The console beeped angrily, and a holographic display flickered to life above their heads. It showed a map of the ship with blinking red dots marking areas of sabotage. Kaller frowned, tapping one of the dots to zoom in. "Look at this," he said, pointing. "Every one of these is a critical system. Someone's making a surgical strike, or a drunken brawl depending on their success rate," Elira replied. As if on cue, the lights in the core room sputtered and died, plunging them into darkness. Rathok swore loudly, and Kaller could hear the click of weapons being readied. He fumbled for his flashlight, muttering under his breath, "Of course." Because things weren't complicated enough already. His light flicked on, illuminating a scene that wouldn't have looked out of place in a horror film. Shadows loomed long and twisted, and the air was thick with the hum of machinery fighting a losing battle. "Stay calm," Rathok barked, though his voice held more bravado than reassurance. "If anything moves, shoot it." Kaller resisted the urge to comment on the intelligence of that plan given their current situation. Instead, he returned his attention to the console, which was still stubbornly offline. "Any brilliant ideas?" Elira asked, her voice tight. "Just one," Kaller replied, reaching for his comm unit. "Vexen, you there?" The comm crackled, and the captain's voice came through, distorted by static. "Kaller, report. We've hit a snag," Kaller said by way of understatement. "The core room's dark, and we've got shapeshifter activity on the board." "Wonderful," Vexen replied dryly. "Just what we needed. Can you identify them?" "Not yet," Kaller admitted. "But I've got an idea. It's just risky as hell." "I'm listening." Kaller took a deep breath, knowing how insane this would sound. "We scanned for unusual biosignatures. Shapeshifters can mimic appearances but not cellular structures. We rig a biometric test, something painless but effective. Blood samples, maybe." "Great," Elira said, sarcastic as ever, "because everyone loves getting stuck with needles." "And what if they refuse?" Rathok asked, skeptical. "Then we have our imposters," Kaller replied. "Or a mutiny." "But I'm really hoping for the former." Vexen was silent for a moment, probably weighing their limited options. "Do it," he finally said. "I'll prep the crew. Just remember, the last thing we need is open warfare on this ship." "No pressure," Kaller muttered as the comm went dead. He turned to Elira. "Let's get to work." They spent the next few hours rigging a makeshift scanning device from spare parts, more duct tape than technology. Kaller couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of pride. If humanity ever needed an official motto, it would probably be, "We'll make it work. Somehow." "Okay, moment of truth," Kaller announced, flipping the switch on their contraption. It hummed to life, glowing ominously. Elira looked at their Frankenstein device skeptically. "You're sure this won't blow up in our faces?" "No," Kaller said honestly. "But we've got to try." The enforcers lined up, grumbling but compliant. One by one they submitted to the scan, each reading confirmed as human. They moved on to other crew members, tension mounting with every beep of the scanner. "So far, so good," Rathok said, though his tone suggested he was expecting the worst. "But we're not out of the woods yet." The process continued, slow and methodical. Kaller tried not to let his nerves show, even as the crew's unease grew palpable. "I swear, if this turns out to be for nothing." one crew member grumbled, but fell silent under Rathok's glare. Finally, they reached the end of the line, the last few crew members awaiting their turn. Kaller wiped his brow, his heart pounding. "Let's finish this," he said, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. The scanner let out a sharp, discordant beep different from the others. Kaller's heart skipped, his gaze snapping to the screen. "Gotcha," Elira breathed, eyes fixed on the readout. The crew member, a nondescript man from supply, paled, backing away slowly. "There must be a mistake," he stammered, but the words rang hollow. Rathok raised his rifle, eyes hard. "We don't make mistakes." The imposter's facade flickered, rippling like disturbed water. The crew gasped as the man's features twisted, reforming into something alien and unsettling. It was as if someone had taken a human and blended it with a nightmare. "Shapeshifter," Kaller said, stating the obvious. "Well, I'll be damned," Rathok muttered. "I knew it." The creature lunged, moving with unnatural speed. But Rathok was faster, squeezing the trigger with grim efficiency. The shot rang out, echoing in the confined space, and the shapeshifter crumpled to the floor, its form disintegrating into a mess of chitin and slime. For a moment, no one spoke, the reality of what they'd witnessed hanging in the air like smoke. "Is it dead?" Elira asked, poking the remains with the toe of her boot. "Dead enough," Rathok replied, lowering his weapon. "Let's hope there's not more where that came from." Kaller nodded, though relief was tempered with the knowledge that their problems were far from over. They had proven the existence of shapeshifters, but the ship was still a ticking time bomb. And who knew how many more imposters lurked in the shadows, waiting to strike? "We report back to Vexen," Kaller said, trying to sound more optimistic than he felt. "This is a start, but there's more work to do." As they made their way back through the ship, Kaller couldn't shake the feeling that they'd only scratched the surface. Identifying one shapeshifter was a victory, but it wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. At least now they had proof, and with it, a chance to fight back. They might be outnumbered, outgunned, and in over their heads, but they were human. And if there was one thing humans excelled at, it was turning desperate situations into miraculous outcomes. "Just another day on the Resilience," Kaller muttered, earning a weary grin from Elira. "Yeah," she said. "We might just survive this mess after all." Kaller didn't reply, but he hoped she was right. They had a long way to go, and only time would tell if they'd make it through in one piece. But as they stepped into the corridor, the crew rallying behind them, he felt a flicker of hope. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't entirely misplaced. Kaller fiddled with the makeshift scanner, its duct-taped seams glaring with the promise of imminent failure. "Well, that worked like a charm," he muttered, glancing at the gooey remains of the shapeshifter. "If by charm you mean a complete friggin' mess." Elira kicked at the puddle of alien gunk, making a face like she'd stepped in something nasty. "Next time, let's bring a mop. Or better yet, let's not find any more of these things." Rathok reloaded his rifle with a practiced click, his expression as hard as the gunmetal he carried. "We're not done," he said, as if that wasn't obvious. "We've got one down, but who knows how many are still slinking around the ship." "Great," Jessa chirped from the shadows, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "because I was starting to miss the thrill of nearly dying every 5 minutes. Kaller shook his head, turning back to the console. "If I could get this damn thing working, maybe we could pinpoint where our shape-shifting friends are skulking." The console, however, seemed more interested in displaying an endless loop of corrupted nonsense, like it had taken inspiration from modern art. Kaller cursed under his breath, wishing he had a magic wand or a sledgehammer. "Any luck?" Elira asked, peering over his shoulder. "Sure," Kaller snorted. "If by luck you mean absolutely none, this code is more scrambled than Rathok's breakfast." "Hey, I like my eggs that way," Rathok grunted, not looking up from his weapon. Captain Vexen's voice crackled through the comm unit like a reminder of authority amid chaos. "Kaller, status update. We've got one shapeshifter down," Kaller reported, "but the ship's systems are still playing dead." "I think our friend here wasn't working alone." "Understatement of the decade," Vexen replied dryly. "Get those systems back online or we're all going to be breathing vacuum." No pressure, Kaller muttered once the comm went silent. He rubbed his temples, trying to think over the pounding in his head. The core room was an orchestra of failing machinery, each creak and groan a reminder of their imminent doom. The flickering LED cast shadows that danced like mocking specters, daring them to find a solution before everything went to hell. Jessa leaned against a console, inspecting her nails with exaggerated boredom. "So, what's the plan, Brainiac? We gonna jury-rig our way out of this, or should I start writing my will?" Kaller resisted the urge to retort with something sharp. Instead, he took a deep breath, focusing his mind. "Let's see if there's a pattern to the sabotage points. Maybe we can figure out where they'll strike next." Elira nodded, pulling up the holographic display that had shown the sabotage points earlier. "Here we go. We've got life support systems, propulsion, and, oh look, the food dispensers. Real humane, these shapeshifters." Kaller squinted at the map, tracing the red dots with a finger. "They're targeting systems that'll either kill us quick or make us wish we were dead. Clever bastards. Nothing like a bit of existential dread to liven up the day," Jessa said with a grin. Rathok, ever the pragmatist, pointed to a cluster of dots on the display. "We focus on the critical points. Get there, secure them, and hope to hell we can prevent another breach." "Hope," Kaller said, "is not a strategy, but it'll have to do." With that, they moved out, the corridors of the Resilience eerily quiet in the wake of the shapeshifters' exposure. The crew they passed eyed them with a mix of apprehension and trust, the kind that only comes when there are no better options. The corridor leading to the life support systems was a claustrophobic metal tunnel, lined with pipes and wires that hummed with barely contained energy. Kaller couldn't help but feel like they were walking into the gullet of some massive beast, waiting to be devoured. They reached the door, secured with a keypad that looked like it had been through several rounds of amateur surgery. Kaller stepped forward, trying to recall the access code through the haze of fatigue. "Any day now," Jessa quipped, glancing over her shoulder. "I think the floor just moved." Kaller punched in the code, the door grinding open with the enthusiasm of a depressed butler. "After you," he said, gesturing grandly. The life support room was an intricate web of machinery, every panel and pipe essential to keeping the ship's fragile ecosystem intact, or at least it should have been. Currently, it was more like a monument to impending disaster. "Smells like a gremlin convention in here," Rathok commented, sniffing the air. "Something's burning." Kaller grimaced, eyes scanning for the source of the problem. It didn't take long. A junction box on the far wall was sparking like it was celebrating Guy Fawkes Night. "There," he said, pointing. Elira moved in, toolkit at the ready. "Cover me," she said, not waiting for a reply as she began her work. Jessa stood guard, her eyes darting around the room. "If anything so much as breathes funny, I'm shooting first and asking questions later." "Like you need an excuse," Rathok said, taking up position by the door. As Elira worked, Kaller moved to a nearby console, trying to coax some life into the display. It flickered reluctantly, the interface a mess of error messages and warnings. "Come on, you piece of junk," he muttered, tapping the screen like it owed him money. The console spat out a stream of gibberish, then stabilized, showing a status report that was as cheerful as a eulogy. "Looks like someone didn't want us fixing this," Kaller observed, scanning the list of failures. "Good thing you don't take hints," Jessa replied, her voice carrying a note of admiration. Elira cursed under her breath, the sound of tools clattering against metal punctuating her frustration. "This would be easier if I had, I don't know, some actual working equipment." "Where's the fun in that?" Kaller said, glancing at the console again. "If we don't get this fixed, we're going to find out what a vacuum shower feels like." Suddenly, the lights flickered, the room plunging into temporary darkness before stabilizing into a dim glow. Kaller's heart skipped a beat, the reality of their situation pressing down like a weight. "How's it looking?" Rathok asked, his voice a steady anchor amidst chaos. Elira wiped her brow, stepping back from the panel. "Not great. It'll hold for now, but if another junction blows, we're screwed." Comforting, Jessa said, sarcasm dripping from her words. Let's hope the next one's easier. With the system temporarily stabilized, they moved on to propulsion, the corridors echoing with the distant rumble of engines struggling against their restraints. Kaller felt the vibration through his boots, a reminder of the precariousness of their existence. The propulsion room was even more of a mess, wires hanging like vines in a jungle, conduits spitting sparks like angry cats. If life support was a disaster, this was the apocalypse. Looks like someone had a tantrum, Jessa said, surveying the damage. Rathok moved forward, examining the exposed wiring. I've seen prettier war zones. We need this fixed, or we're going to become the newest addition to deep space debris. Kaller set to work with Elira, their combined efforts a frantic dance of wires and circuit boards. The system fought them at every step, as if it had developed a personality and decided it didn't like them very much. Why do I get the feeling this ship hates us? Elira mused, her fingers moving deftly despite the sweat trickling down her face. Probably because it does, Kaller replied. Or it's just tired of our crap. Jessa kept watch, her gaze scanning the room for any sign of trouble. You'd think with all this tech we'd have less to worry about and more time to relax. That's the dream, Rathok said. But reality's a cruel mistress. As if to punctuate his words, the ship shuddered, a groan reverberating through the hull that made Kaller's stomach drop. He doubled his efforts, working faster, every second feeling like an eternity. Finally, the console beeped, a sound so sweet it was almost music. The propulsion system whirred to life, the vibrations evening out as power surged back into the engines. Well, that's something, Kaller said, wiping his hands on his pants. Assuming it doesn't blow up in our faces. Elira gave him a tired smile. One crisis at a time, right? The comm unit crackled, Vexen's voice cutting through the static. Kaller, are we good? For now, Kaller replied. But the ship systems are held together with duct tape in desperation. We need to find the rest of those shapeshifters before they finish what they started. Understood, Vexen said. I'm mobilizing the rest of the crew, but we need to be cautious. The last thing we want is a panic. No kidding, Kaller muttered as the comm went silent. The team regrouped, exchanging glances that spoke of exhaustion and determination in equal measure. They'd won a small victory, but the war was far from over. So, what's next? Jessa asked, her voice lighter despite the tension in the air. Kaller looked at his crew, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. We keep moving. Every minute counts, and we can't afford to rest until we're sure this ship won't tear itself apart. Onward then, Rathok said, hefting his rifle with grim purpose. As they stepped back into the corridor, the flickering lights casting a sporadic glow on their path, Kaller couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, they had a fighting chance. But deep down, he knew the hardest battles were yet to come, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. They'd faced shapeshifters and sabotage, but the true test would be surviving the chaos that lay ahead. For now, though, they had a ship to save and a crew to protect. And as long as they could draw breath, they'd fight for both, one crisis at a time. The resilience was about as resilient as a paper umbrella in a monsoon. With each creak and shudder of the ship, Kaller felt another year fall off his life expectancy. The corridors felt like a funeral procession, with the lights flickering in time like wonky pallbearers. Feels like walking through a junkyard's nervous breakdown, Jessa remarked, her tone casual as she kicked a loose panel back into place. If this ship was a person, it'd be on life support. Kaller winced at the thought, glancing sideways at Elira, who was peering into the darkness with all the enthusiasm of a dentist at a candy convention. The shapeshifters have really done a number on us. Systems are failing faster than a first-year cadet on a bender. Never thought I'd miss the days when our biggest problem was finding enough coffee, Elira muttered, her fingers fiddling with the scanner that had been about as reliable as a politician's promise. Coffee's a luxury when you're not sure if the next breath will be your last, Jessa quipped, her sarcasm as sharp as ever. Rathok, always the stoic, hefted his plasma rifle with grim determination. Let's just focus on keeping everyone alive long enough for Vexen to pull a miracle out of his ass. That's one place I never want to see miracles come from, Kaller replied, rubbing his temples in a futile attempt to ward off the headache forming from stress and lack of sleep. The group trudged on, their footsteps echoing down the corridor like a funeral dirge. It seemed like the ship was trying to set a new record for things going wrong simultaneously. Life support was hanging on by a thread. Propulsion had been patched up with the electronic equivalent of chewing gum. And now, the power cores were starting to sputter like an old man trying to climb stairs. "Next stop, the power core," Kaller announced, his voice carrying a hint of fake cheerfulness. "If we're lucky, it'll be a quick fix. If we're unlucky, well, we'll find out what it's like to be a floating popsicle. Always looking on the bright side, aren't you?" Jessa's smile was all teeth and no warmth, a testament to their shared gallows humor. They entered the power core room, and it was the closest thing to hell Kaller could imagine. The place was a mess of tangled wires, sparking conduits, and the smell of something burning that was both worrying and strangely familiar. "Smells like a BBQ at a scrapyard," Rathok observed, nose wrinkling as he surveyed the chaos. "Or my Aunt Gerda's cooking," Kaller added, trying to lighten the mood even as his mind raced for a solution. Elira crouched down, examining a console that looked like it had lost a fight with a particularly angry grizzly bear. "The shapeshifters must have been here. Either that, or we hired a bunch of blindfolded engineers last time we docked." "Could be both," Kaller said. "Considering how much this ship hates us, wouldn't surprise me if it threw us under the bus whenever it got the chance." Jessa snorted. "We'd need a bigger bus." They dove into the task, Kaller and Elira working side by side while Rathok and Jessa kept watch. Kaller could feel his frustration mounting as each attempt to stabilize the system was met with resistance from the ancient and petulant technology. "Why does it feel like this ship is actively trying to kill us?" Elira grumbled, her words punctuated by the sharp snap of a wire that had finally given up the ghost. "Maybe it's just tired of our crap," Kaller replied, smirking slightly even as he cursed under his breath. "Ship's got a sense of humor then," Jessa said, keeping her gaze fixed on the doorway. "Or a really twisted sense of self-preservation," Rathok chuckled darkly. "If this hunk of metal had any sense, it would have ejected us into space ages ago." Finally, with a grunt of triumph, Kaller managed to coax the power core into a semblance of functionality. The lights flickered once-twice, before settling into a steady glow that was about as comforting as a candle in a hurricane. "Not bad for a couple of amateurs," Elira said, stepping back to admire their handiwork. "Let's just hope it holds," Kaller replied, trying not to let the weight of their situation crush him. The comm unit crackled again, and Captain Vexen's voice spilled into the room like a lifeline. "Status update, Kaller. Are we going to implode, or do I need to keep rehearsing my eulogy?" Kaller couldn't help but grin. "Not today, Captain. We've got the power core stabilized for now, but it's as fragile as a politician's promise." "Glad to hear it," Vexen said. "Keep moving. We've got reports of shapeshifter activity in the cargo bay. If they're planning something, I want to know about it yesterday." "Understood," Kaller replied. He cut the connection and turned to his team, who were looking at him with a mix of exhaustion and determination. "You heard the man. Let's go crash a shapeshifter party." They made their way to the cargo bay, the corridor ahead stretching like a gaping maw ready to swallow them whole. Every step felt like a gamble, a roll of the dice in a game that was rigged from the start. "Think we'll get an invite, or are we crashing this thing?" Jessa asked, gripping her weapon a little tighter. "Crashing, definitely," Kaller said. "We're the unwanted guests in this little drama." The cargo bay was cavernous and filled with the detritus of 1,000 missions. It was a graveyard of past endeavors, and every shadow seemed to hold the promise of danger. "Feels like a perfect place for an ambush," Rathok said, his eyes scanning the room with the wariness of a veteran soldier. Kaller couldn't help but agree. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and he had the distinct impression they were being watched. "Stay sharp," Shapeshifters could be anywhere or anyone, Jessa chuckled softly. You know, on a bad day you could be a shapeshifter. Thanks for the vote of confidence, Kala replied. Remind me to send you a thank you card. They moved cautiously, checking every nook and cranny, every potential hiding spot. It felt like a dance, one that was growing more frantic with each passing second. The cargo bay was a warren of shadows and dust, and their only company was the oppressive silence. Nothing here, Elira whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Maybe we missed them. Or maybe they're just really good at hide and seek, Jessa replied, her tone light but her eyes scanning the darkness. Just as Kaller was about to suggest they regroup, a sound echoed through the bay, a soft rustle barely audible over the thrum of the ship's systems. They froze, each member of the team tensing, eyes flicking towards the source of the noise. There, Rathok said, gesturing with a nod towards a stack of crates at the far end of the bay. They moved as one, advancing cautiously, weapons at the ready. As they drew closer, the tension in the air became almost tangible, a living thing that wrapped around them like a shroud. Ready? Kaller asked, glancing at his team. Born ready, Jessa replied, a wicked grin spreading across her face. Let's do this, Elira added, her expression set with determination. With a nod, Kaller signaled for Rathok to circle around while the rest of them approached head-on. The crates loomed large in front of them, a monolith of potential danger. As they rounded the corner, the source of the noise revealed itself. A crew member, wide-eyed and terrified, huddled against the crates. They looked up at Kaller and the team with a mixture of fear and relief. Don't shoot, the crew member pleaded, raising their hands in surrender. Kaller hesitated, glancing at his team. Prove you're not a shapeshifter, the crew member blinked, confusion mingling with fear. How? I don't even know how to prove I'm me, let alone not them. Jessa lowered her weapon slightly, her gaze appraising. What's your favorite color? What, favorite color? Answer the question. Blue, Jessa nodded, apparently satisfied. Good enough for me. Kaller lowered his weapon but kept it ready just in case. All right, you're coming with us. We can't risk leaving you on your own. The crew member nodded, scrambling to their feet with a speed that suggested they were in no hurry to be left behind. Thank you. I thought I was done for. Stick close, Rathok said, rejoining the group. We've got to find the rest of these shapeshifters before they turn this ship into a very expensive coffin. They moved on, the tension easing slightly now that they had found one of their own. But the danger was still present, lurking in every shadow, waiting for them to slip up. You know, Jessa said as they moved through the corridors, this whole situation would make a hell of a movie. Kaller snorted. Yeah, and we'd all be played by the second-rate actors who never quite make it big. Speak for yourself, Elira chimed in. I demand at least a B-list star to play me. Dream big, Rathok said. But first, let's make sure we've got a future to dream about. They approached the next potential shapeshifter hideout, a storage room that was supposed to be locked down but had its door ajar like an uninvited guest had slipped in. Kaller signaled for silence, and they moved into position, ready for whatever lay inside. As they entered, the room was empty aside from some scattered supplies and a console blinking lazily in the corner. No shapeshifters in sight, but the feeling of being watched remained, a persistent itch they couldn't quite scratch. Looks like we missed the party, Jessa said, her voice laced with frustration. Or we're the entertainment, Kaller replied, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. The console flickered, drawing his attention. He moved closer, typing commands with fingers that felt like lead, and watched as data scrolled across the screen. It was a mess of corrupted files and error messages, but there was something there, a pattern that was beginning to emerge. They're targeting specific systems, Kaller muttered, half to himself and half to his team. There's a logic to it, even if it looks like chaos. Sounds like my last relationship, Jessa said, peering over his shoulder. Focus, Rathok grunted, his patience wearing thin. Kaller nodded, diving deeper into the data. If we can figure out this pattern, we might have a chance of predicting their next move. Well then, Elira said, her voice filled with renewed determination. "Let's make sure these shapeshifters don't get the last laugh." Kaller felt a flicker of hope, a tiny flame in the darkness. They might be outmatched, outgunned, and out of their minds, but they weren't out of the fight yet. And if the shapeshifters thought this was going to be easy, well, they had another thing coming. The blinking console was like an old dog that wouldn't learn new tricks, stubbornly stuck in its ways. Kaller massaged his temples, trying to coax some kind of coherent scheme from the mess of data. A few feet away, Jessa was fiddling with her weapon, a look that said she was just about ready to give it a new home in someone's skull. "All right, folks," Kaller announced. "Looks like we need to embrace the crazy," Rathok grunted. "Define crazy, 'cause I'm not in the mood for interpretive dance. Our mysterious shapeshifters here are expecting us to act like disciplined soldiers. So, what if we throw discipline out the airlock and act like lunatics?" Elira perked up, her interest piqued. "You mean act like we're out of our minds?" "Exactly. That shouldn't be too hard," Jessa muttered, not bothering to hide her smirk. "Think about it," Kaller continued, warming to his theme. "These shapeshifters probably have a plan, right? But what if we don't follow the script? Randomness, unpredictability, that's what human creativity is all about." "Chaotic stupid," Rathok grunted. "I like it. Sounds like every meeting with Captain Vexen," Jessa added, dry as a dessert. Elira glanced at the console, then back at the group. "All right, chaos it is, but how do we organize this madness?" "What if we start by messing with the ship's systems?" Kaller suggested. "Give them a taste of their own medicine." Jessa gave him a look. "You're talking about making this already malfunctioning ship even less reliable," Kaller shrugged. "It's not like it's winning any reliability awards as is. We hit random systems, create distractions, misdirection. They'll waste time chasing shadows." "Sounds like a Friday night," Rathok said, hefting his plasma rifle with newfound enthusiasm. "Right, let's split up. I'll start with the life support backup systems. Nothing major, just enough to make them think twice. Jessa, you take the propulsion diagnostics. Elira, go after the comms but leave them functional enough for our use. Rathok, you're on persuasion duty with that cannon of yours." Jessa raised an eyebrow. "And if we run into any shapeshifters?" "Improvise," Kaller replied. "And remember, we're not just fighting shapeshifters. We're fighting their expectations." Rathok cracked a smile, a rare sight. "I'm good at disappointing expectations." With a plan as solid as a house of cards in a storm, they dispersed, each heading to their assigned systems like the world's most dysfunctional pit crew. Kaller couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. If they could throw enough chaos into the mix, maybe they could even the odds. He reached the life support backup console, a relic from a bygone era. It hummed with the kind of confidence only the truly senile possess. Kaller tinkered with the settings, adjusting them just enough to create discomfort without triggering a full-blown crisis. The ship's already struggling systems were about to get a little more interesting. Jessa, meanwhile, was knee-deep in propulsion diagnostics. She'd never met a system she couldn't intimidate, and this one was no exception. With a few twists and tweaks, she unleashed a symphony of dissonance, a concerto of power fluctuations that would send any would-be saboteur into a tailspin of panic. Elira took a deep breath before diving into the comms array. It was like trying to unravel a ball of yarn in zero gravity, but she managed to insert just enough static and interference to make communication a guessing game. The shapeshifters wouldn't know if they were talking to each other or a radio drama. Rathok, ever the pragmatist, took a more direct approach. He found a corridor junction and set up a few surprises for anyone foolish enough to wander through. Nothing lethal, just enough to make a person reconsider their career choices. As they worked, the ship groaned around them, a cantankerous beast protesting the indignities heaped upon it. Kaller imagined the Resilients had long since given up any hope of a peaceful retirement. In the dim light, Kaller's comm unit crackled to life. "Kaller, you there?" It was Elira, her voice a mix of static and stress. "Yeah, I'm here." "What's up? Just a heads up, the comms might be a little unpredictable for a while." "Unpredictable's the theme of the day," he replied, grinning despite himself. You having fun, you bet. Nothing like a little creative chaos to get the blood pumping. They regrouped in the mess hall, a place that had seen better days and better meals. The air was tinged with the scent of burned protein packs and desperation. It was as good a place as any to plan their next move. How'd it go? Kaller asked. Like a charm, Jessa said, her eyes gleaming with mischief. The propulsion system's now throwing fits like a toddler in a candy store. Comms are a scramble, Elira added. Good luck getting a straight message through. Rathok just nodded, a man of few words but many actions. The kind you want on your side when things go south. Kaller leaned back, feeling the weight of the ship's constant groans and creaks. All right, now we wait and see how the shapeshifters handle a little anarchy, Jessa snorted. Bet they're regretting picking on humans now. A regular freaking rainbow coalition of madness, Elira said, shaking her head. We might be a mess, but we're their mess, Kaller replied, a small flame of hope flickering in his chest. The ship lurched unexpectedly, throwing them off balance. Jessa cursed, grabbing onto the nearest table to steady herself. What the hell was that? Guess the ship's joining the fun, Kaller said, trying to sound optimistic. Or it's just indigestion. Elira checked a small handheld display. Looks like power fluctuations. We must have hit a nerve. Good, Rathok said, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. Let's keep it that way. The comm unit erupted with Captain Vexen's exasperated voice. Kaller, what's happening over there? The whole ship's going haywire. We're improvising, Captain. It's chaos, but it's our chaos. Well, improvise without getting us killed, would you? Working on it. The connection cut off with a buzz, leaving them in silence once more. The hum of the ship was a constant reminder of how close they danced to the edge. So, what's next? Jessa asked, her voice thick with adrenaline and excitement. We keep moving, Kaller said. If they can't predict us, they can't stop us. An unpredictable mess, Elira mused. Sounds like a typical day on this ship. Exactly, Kaller replied. Let's make sure they remember it. They ventured back into the labyrinthine corridors of the Resilience, each turn and junction a minefield of potential danger. Their footsteps echoed in the hollow halls, a symphony of defiance against the oppressive silence. The ship was a living entity, wounded and bleeding, yet somehow still fighting. For all its faults, it was their home, a fact that might just be enough to turn the tide. As they neared the cargo bay again, they could hear the sounds of confusion, a series of thuds, crashes, and muffled shouts. Kaller held up a hand, signaling for silence. They crept closer, each step a gamble. Peering around the corner, they saw a group of crew members arguing with what could only be shapeshifters. The creatures were indistinguishable from their human counterparts, an unsettling reminder of how perilous their situation was. What's the plan? Jessa whispered, her grip on the weapon tightening. Confusion, Kaller replied. Let's give them a show they won't forget. With a nod, they burst into the open, yelling and making as much noise as possible. The sudden explosion of chaos was like a bomb going off in the midst of the gathered shapeshifters. The impostors hesitated, caught off guard by the whirlwind of insanity descending upon them. Kaller and his team moved with purpose, striking and retreating, never giving the enemy a chance to regroup. Rathok's plasma rifle spat beams of energy, herding the shapeshifters into corners. Jessa and Elira flanked them, their movements erratic and unpredictable, like a pair of crazed dancers in a cosmic ballet. Kaller felt a surge of adrenaline, his heart pounding in his chest. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and yet somehow winning. The shapeshifters couldn't adapt fast enough to the madness swirling around them. In the chaos, one of the crew members, a genuine human, not an imposter, managed to break free, joining the fight with a determination born of desperation. The tide was turning, albeit slowly. The shapeshifters, realizing they were losing control, began to retreat, their forms flickering as they shifted between identities in a last-ditch effort to escape the pandemonium. Kaller didn't give them the chance. With a final push, they drove the imposters back, leaving them scrambling for cover. As the dust settled, the team regrouped, their breaths ragged and hearts racing. They were battered, bruised, but victorious. "Not bad for a bunch of amateurs," Jessa said, her grin wide despite the exhaustion etched on her face. "We make chaos look good," Elira added, a hint of pride in her voice. Rathok simply nodded, his expression stoic as ever, but Kaller knew the big man was pleased. Captain Vexen's voice crackled over the comm unit once more. "Status update. We've got him on the run, Captain," Kaller replied, unable to keep the triumph from his voice. There was a pause, then a chuckle. "Keep it up. You might just save this rusty bucket yet. We'll do our best." They stood in the aftermath, surrounded by the debris of their makeshift battlefield. The ship was still groaning, still teetering on the edge, but Kaller felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe they were out of their depth, fighting a war that seemed unwinnable. But as long as they had chaos on their side, they had a chance. And sometimes a chance was all you needed. Kaller leaned against the battered console, sweat dripping down his forehead like the last drops of fuel from a rigged engine. His heart was still a jackhammer in his chest, but the adrenaline rush was fading, leaving behind the familiar exhaustion. "Well," he said, voice dripping with mock cheer, "that was a good warm-up." Jessa, rubbing a bruised shoulder, chuckled darkly. "Warm-up for what?" "The final act of our one-way ticket to hell." Elira was already busy poking at her comms array, her fingers moving with the speed of someone trying to disarm a bomb. "At least we didn't get blown to bits," she said, her grin as sharp as a knife. Always a plus in my book. Rathok, ever the silent type, simply stood there, a mountain of a man with a plasma rifle slung over his shoulder like a particularly dangerous accessory. His silence was the comforting kind, though, the kind that said he had your back in the fight, and afterward he'd buy you a drink, if they ever got drinks again. Kaller nodded, trying to ignore the ship's groans that resonated through the walls like the belly aches of a giant. "All right, we've shaken them up. Let's see where the shapeshifters are now, shall we?" The corridors of the Resilient stretched ahead, dark and ominous, like the throat of some ancient beast. Kaller led the way, feeling the weight of the ship's failing systems pressing in with every step. They were a ragtag band of chaos makers, and the shapeshifters wouldn't know what hit them. Jessa fell into step beside him, her eyes scanning the shadows. "You think they expected that back there?" "Not a chance," Kaller replied, keeping his voice low. "We're the most unpredictable bunch in this corner of the galaxy." "Yeah, well, let's hope that's enough to keep us alive," Elira muttered, tapping at her handheld scanner, which was about as reliable as a drunk pilot on a joyride. "Alive and kicking," Rathok rumbled, his voice like gravel rolling down a hill. The ship's core was their destination, a place that felt more like the heart of a dying star every day. They moved through the twisting passageways, the air thick with tension and something else, fear maybe, or just the smell of recycled sweat from generations of spacefaring humanity. As they rounded a corner, the distant sound of voices stopped them in their tracks. Kaller held up a hand, signaling for silence. The voices were familiar, yet tinged with an edge of desperation. Perfect. They were close. Peering around the corner, Kaller spied a group of crewmen locked in a heated discussion. Among them, a few faces shifted and flickered like television screens on the fritz. Shapeshifters, no doubt about it. Again, the unsettling reminder that they could be anyone, that they could be us. "All right," Kaller whispered, turning back to his team. "Time to rain on their parade." Jessa's grin was feral, like a wolf catching the scent of prey. "Let's give them a show they'll never forget." Rathok's smile was slow, but it was there, a rare sight like a comet blazing across the night sky. "With pleasure." Elira adjusted her comms, letting static fill the air like the opening act of a chaotic symphony. "Let's turn this into a party." With a nod, Kaller led the charge, bursting into the open with all the subtlety of a meteor impact. The sudden cacophony of shouts and movement was a shockwave that rippled through the gathered shapeshifters. The impostors hesitated, their gazes darting around wildly as if expecting the walls to come alive and eat them. Kaller's team moved like phantoms, hitting hard and fast, never staying in one place long enough to be pinned down. Rathok's plasma rifle sent arcs of energy slicing through the air, herding the shapeshifters like confused cattle. Jessa wove through the chaos with a dancer's grace, her every movement a testament to human unpredictability. Elira maintained the calm's interference, ensuring that the imposters' attempts to coordinate were as effective as trying to herd cats in a hurricane. Through the melee, Kalar focused on one goal: sowing chaos. The shapeshifters were creatures of mimicry, and mimicry relied on predictability. But here, in this maelstrom of madness, there was no pattern to follow, no rhythm to disrupt. They'd chosen the wrong humans to mess with. Amid the confusion, Kalar spotted a particularly twitchy shapeshifter trying to slink away. He cut it off with a grin that was all teeth. Going somewhere, the creature flickered, its form glitching like a faulty hologram. "You won't win," it hissed, its voice a distorted echo of human speech. "Winning's overrated," Kalar replied, stepping closer. "We aim for survival with style." With a swift movement, he brought the butt of his makeshift club, a repurposed piece of piping, down on its head. The shapeshifter crumpled, its form unraveling like a poorly tied shoelace. The rest of the creatures, realizing they were outclassed in chaos, began to fall back, their human disguises slipping in their hurry to escape. Kalar and his team pressed the advantage, pushing the shapeshifters toward the ship's core, a place where their options would dwindle to none. "Keep moving," Kalar shouted, his voice cutting through the pandemonium. "Don't let up." Jessa was a blur, her laughter ringing out like a bell. They didn't sign up for this kind of insanity. Elira kept the pressure on the comms, her fingers dancing over the controls like a maestro conducting a symphony of static. "I've got their signals all tangled. They can't even call their moms for help." Rathok, ever the steady hand, swept the corridors with his plasma rifle, ensuring no stragglers slipped through the net. "Flush him out," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried authority. The shapeshifters retreated, disoriented and demoralized, until they found themselves cornered in the core. Their forms flickered between human and alien, as if undecided on which was more pitiable. Kalar stepped forward, the makeshift club resting on his shoulder like a lazy vulture. "End of the line, folks." He let the weight of the statement sink in. "You picked the wrong ship to mess with." One of the shapeshifters, its form stuttering like a broken record, spat out words like venom. "This isn't over, human." "Others will come." "Maybe," Kalar said, shrugging. "But next time try someone less used to surviving against the odds." As the last of the shapeshifters slumped to the ground, the air cleared, both literally and metaphorically. The ship, though still creaking and groaning, felt lighter, as if relieved to be rid of the imposters. Jessa punched the air, her face flushed with triumph. "We did it." Elira gave a mock salute, her grin wide enough to light up the room. "Here's to the most chaotic crew in the galaxy." Rathok, as always, simply nodded, his eyes scanning for any remaining threats. Ever watchful, ever ready. The comm unit crackled, and Captain Vexen's voice came through, tinged with something that might have been pride. "Kalar, report." "We've got it under control, Captain," Kalar replied, allowing himself a moment of satisfaction. "Shapeshifters are neutralized, the ship's yours again." There was a pause, a silence that spoke volumes. "Well done," Vexen said at last. "Now let's get this rust bucket back on track." Kalar turned to his team, the adrenaline still thrumming through his veins. "All right, folks, let's patch her up." They set to work, each falling into the familiar rhythm of post-battle repairs. The Resilience was a mess, but it was their mess, and they'd fight tooth and nail to keep it running. For all its faults, it was home. Jessa tackled the propulsion systems, her eyes gleaming with determination. "Who needs a stable ride anyway?" Elira dove into the comms, her hands flying over the controls. "Let's see if we can make this thing talk straight." Rathok took up position by the entrance, ever the silent guardian, ever the stalwart protector. As Kalar watched his team, he felt a surge of pride. They were a ragtag bunch, barely held together by duct tape and sheer stubbornness, but they'd shown the shapeshifters what humanity was all about. Chaos, creativity, survival. The Resilience might have been limping, its systems gasping for breath, but it was still flying. And as long as it flew, so did they. In the end, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about being human, imperfect, unpredictable, and utterly relentless. The shapeshifters had underestimated them, thinking them simple creatures of habit. They'd learned the hard way that humans didn't follow the rules. They made their own. And that, Kaller thought with a wry smile, was what made them so damn dangerous. As the light flickered back to life in the core, casting a warm glow over the battered team, Kaller knew they'd be ready for whatever came next. Because if chaos was their ally, they'd never fight alone. Kaller surveyed the aftermath like a proud homeowner after a particularly wild house party. The resilience was still standing, barely, but it was theirs. Small victories, he mused, were the best kind, especially when the universe seemed intent on serving you nothing but cosmic-sized headaches. The ship's corridors were silent now, save for the occasional groan from the bulkheads, like an old man with bad knees. The shapeshifters were either unconscious, tied up like demented Christmas presents, or scattered like dust in the wind. Not their finest ire if Kaller was any judge. "Well," Jessa said, rubbing her bruised shoulder with a wince that turned into a grin, "I'd say they're gonna think twice before tangoing with us again." "Assuming they can think at all," Kaller replied, leaning against a battered console that looked like it had seen better centuries. It was one keystroke away from belching smoke. Rathok stood nearby, his plasma rifle slung casually over one shoulder like a trusty umbrella. "Reckon we need to start fixing things before this whole place goes kablooey." "Kablooey?" Elira raised an eyebrow, still fiddling with her comms array. "Is that a technical term, or did you just make it up on the spot?" Rathok shrugged. "Technical enough for this job." Kaller pushed himself away from the console, giving it a pat as if to assure the ship it wasn't alone in its decrepitude. "All right, gang, let's get to it. We've got a whole laundry list of disasters to avert, starting with the life support. Can't have us all suffocating before dinner," Jessa snorted. "Or worse, before we find out if the galley still has those freeze-dried brownies." With that, they split up, each heading to their respective areas of expertise with the kind of resigned determination that only comes from a life of constant firefighting and duct tape heroics. Jessa took the propulsion systems, muttering under her breath as she disappeared into the labyrinthine guts of the ship. Kaller was convinced she was having a long-standing feud with the engines, and that one day they might just settle it with a duel. Elira remained at the comms, coaxing the array into something resembling functionality. "Come on, baby," she cooed to the equipment. "Show me you've still got some spark left." Rathok, ever the watchdog, positioned himself by the ship's entrance, eyes scanning for any unwelcome guests. He was the kind of guy who could make a security drone feel inadequate. Kaller headed for the ship's core, a maze of pipes and consoles that felt like trying to navigate a drunken octopus. His makeshift scanner, held together with more hope than hardware, beeped sporadically in his hand. "Perfect," he muttered. "Just what I need, an opinionated piece of junk." The ship's systems were a mess, thanks to sabotage, neglect, and the occasional enthusiastic but misguided repair attempt. But hey, it was home. Nothing like a bit of unpredictability to keep life interesting. Once he reached the core, Kaller set to work, patching up wires, rerouting circuits, and occasionally cursing the inventor of space travel. As he worked, he thought about the shapeshifters, creatures of mimicry, of order. They tried to impose their tidy chaos on humans, but humans were experts at thriving in the chaos they'd created. "Resilience," he mused, glancing at the ship's name etched above the core. "Hell of a concept." The ship groaned in agreement, or maybe just indigestion. Hard to tell. "Kaller, you done talking to yourself?" Jessa's voice crackled over the comm unit. "Or do you need more alone time with your circuits?" "Just having a little heart-to-heart with the ship," he replied, grinning despite himself. "She's not much of a conversationalist, but she listens. Better than most people," Elira chimed in, her voice tinged with static and amusement. "Got the comms up and running, by the way. We can finally call for help if we decide we're too stubborn to die here. Don't get too hopeful, though," Rathok added. "Help's probably as far away as a politician's promise." Caller chuckled, feeling the camaraderie wrap around him like a warm, familiar blanket. It was this, a ragtag crew of misfits who could make a joke even as the world crumbled around them, that made them dangerous. Resilience wasn't just the ship's name, it was a lifestyle. Bit by bit, the ship systems flickered back to life. The generators hummed with renewed energy and the air felt a degree less stifling. The Resilience was limping, sure, but she'd limp proudly. Caller stepped back from the core, satisfied with the day's work. "Hey team, good news, we're not going to suffocate today." "Fantastic," Jessa replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I was really looking forward to a nice, pleasant asphyxiation." "Always next week," Caller quipped. He glanced around, listening to the thrum of the ship. "We might even stay in one piece long enough to get somewhere not trying to kill us." "That's the dream," Elira said, and even Rathok managed a small, approving grunt. They gathered in the control room, the screens flickering with warnings that now seemed less dire, more like grumpy old men complaining about the weather. Captain Vexen's voice crackled over the comms, rough around the edges but reassuring. "Caller," Vexen said, "status report." "We're in better shape than a week-old sandwich, Captain," Caller replied, straightening up. "Life support's stable, propulsion's holding, and the shapeshifters are finally someone else's problem." Vexen was silent for a moment, and Caller wondered if he could sense the captain's smile. "Good work. Let's chart a course for somewhere less shapeshifty." "Sounds like a plan. Any requests from the crew?" Caller asked, glancing at his team. Jessa leaned back, smiling lazily. "Anywhere with gravity and a decent bar sounds good to me. Preferably one without the risk of being assimilated," Elira added. "Somewhere quiet," Rathok concluded, his voice like the rumble of distant thunder. Caller nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. They'd fought, survived, and come out stronger for it. Destination, anywhere but here then. The Resilience shuddered back to life, propulsion systems kicking in with renewed vigor. As the stars streaked past, Caller felt a familiar sense of wonder, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the universe, humanity had a knack for finding light. They were moving forward, one imperfect step at a time, and that was more than enough. Jessa sighed contentedly, stretching out like a cat in a sunbeam. "You know," she said, "maybe we should put survived against ridiculous odds on our resumes." "Yeah," Caller agreed, chuckling. "Might even land us a spot on the intergalactic talk show circuit." Elira snorted. "As long as we don't have to wear matching jumpsuits." Rathok gave a rare grin, his eyes crinkling at the edges. "Could be a bestseller, How Not to Die in Space. With a sequel, How to Make Friends and Annihilate People," Jessa offered, laughter bubbling up from her. Caller leaned back in his chair, feeling the tension in his muscles slowly unwind. "Well, folks, we did it. We're still here. We're still kicking. And as long as there's space to explore and trouble to find, we'll keep doing just that." "Cheers to that," Jessa said, raising an imaginary glass. The Resilience hummed along, the sound almost like contentment. They were headed into the unknown, but for the first time in what felt like forever, it didn't seem so daunting. Caller watched the stars outside, thinking about humanity's strengths. Chaos, creativity, stubbornness. They'd turned them into weapons, shields, and everything in between. It wasn't about the destination, it was about the journey and the people you'd drag kicking and screaming through it. As long as they were together, they'd face whatever the universe threw their way. And they'd do it with a smile, a wisecrack, and a refusal to back down. Because that's what it meant to be human. And as Caller knew, that was what made them so damn dangerous.